The sky turned the color of a bruise that hadn't finished forming. Margaret Calloway had been watching it from the porch of her farmhouse for the better part of 20 minutes, and she knew that color the way she knew the sound of her own heartbeat. She had seen it twice before in her 68 years on this earth, and both times it had taken something from her that she could never get back. The first time she was 12 years old, standing in almost the same spot where she stood now, wearing her mother's old gardening apron and holding a basket of green beans she had been snapping since breakfast. The sky went that color in about 15 minutes. Her father grabbed her arm and ran. By the time they made it to the root cellar beneath the old barn, the tornado had already taken the structure her grandfather built with his own hands in 1921. 3 horses went with it. Her father sat in the dark and cried for the first time she had ever seen him cry, and she understood that some things once gone simply stay gone. The second time she was 41 years old. She and Walter had just finished dinner. He was washing the dishes, which he always did on Thursdays because that was the deal they had struck 19 years earlier. And Walter Calloway was a man who honored deals. She was pouring his coffee when the radio broke into the middle of a country song with that particular tone that meant the world was about to tilt sideways. They looked at each other across the kitchen. No words needed. They had been together long enough to hold entire conversations in a single glance. Walter did not make it to the cellar with her. He went back for the photograph album. The one that had their wedding pictures and Tommy's baby pictures and the photograph of Walter's father standing in front of the hardware store he owned in Joplin back in 1951. He said he would be right behind her. He said it the way people say things when they believe them completely and have no reason to think otherwise. The tornado hit the northeast corner of the house first. She found Walter 3 hours later out in the south field, still holding the photograph album. Now it was 27 years after that, and Margaret Calloway stood on the porch of the same farmhouse that had been rebuilt after Walter died, watching that same greenish-yellow color spread across the Missouri sky like a stain. And she felt something in her chest that she could not quite name. Not fear exactly. She had used up most of her fear reserves a long time ago. Something quieter than fear. Something that sat behind her ribs and pressed outward without quite breaking through. The radio on the kitchen counter had been going for the better part of an hour. The announcer's voice had that careful quality, that measured steadiness that broadcasters practice specifically for moments when steadiness was the only thing standing between information and panic. He said the storm system had developed faster than predicted. He said it was an EF4. He said the winds were being measured at 170 miles per hour and climbing. He said Tenney County was directly in the projected path and that residents should seek immediate shelter without delay. She turned the radio off. She had heard everything she needed to hear. The farmhouse around her was not what it had been. The paint on the siding was coming away in long strips along the south wall, where the sun hit hardest in the afternoons. The roof above the kitchen had a soft spot she had been meaning to have looked at since the spring, and when it rained heavily, she put a pot on the floor beneath it and listened to the irregular rhythm of water hitting aluminum while she sat in her reading chair and pretended the sound was something more pleasant than what it was. The electricity had been cutting in and out since February. The electrician who came out in March told her the wiring in the east wing needed to be replaced entirely and gave her a number that made her set the estimate down on the counter very carefully, as though it might break if she handled it wrong. Walter's medical bills had taken most of what they had saved. That was the honest truth of it. The truth she did not say out loud to Lorraine when her sister called from Springfield every Sunday afternoon, asking when Maggie was going to be sensible and sell the property. and come live somewhere that had a furnace that worked properly. The bills from those last 14 months had gone through their savings the way water goes through dry soil, fast and total, and leaving nothing behind. She still had the farm. She still had the land. But the margins were thin enough that she could not afford to fix the roof and replace the wiring in the same calendar year. And so she chose one and put the other off. And the year after, she reversed the choice. And in this way, she kept the farmhouse standing through the sheer force of triage. She was not bitter about any of it. She had learned a long time ago that bitterness was a luxury she could not afford. In the same way, she could not afford to replace the wiring and fix the roof simultaneously. It took up space that needed to be used for something more practical. Triage. That was the nurse's way of seeing the world. And she had been a nurse for 30 years before she retired. And the habit of mind did not leave just because she handed in her badge. You looked at what was in front of you. You assessed the severity. You addressed the most urgent problem first. You kept moving. She took one long look at the southwest horizon, where the sky had gone the darkest shade of that green-yellow color she had ever seen it. And she turned toward the barn. The cellar beneath it was the one thing on this property that was genuinely sound. Walter's father had originally dug it in 1947. And Walter himself had reinforced the walls with poured concrete in 1989, after the tornado that took their nearest neighbor's house down to the foundation. He had put in proper steel doors, heavy ones with a locking bar on the inside. He had stocked it with emergency supplies that Maggie refreshed every spring without fail, even in the years when money was tightest. Canned goods, water jugs, a first aid kit she kept stocked to professional standards because old habits died hard. Flashlights with fresh batteries. Blankets sealed in plastic bags against the moisture. A battery-powered lantern. Walter had built it for her specifically. He told her so the day it was finished, standing in the door of the barn with sawdust on his forearms. And that particular expression he got when he was pleased with something but too modest to say so directly. He said he had built it because if he was going to spend the rest of his life next to her, he was going to make absolutely certain she always had somewhere safe to go. She had kissed him on the cheek. He had gone slightly red. She thought about that as she walked toward the barn, the wind already picking up around her ankles and pulling at the hem of her flannel shirt. She thought about Walter building things to last. She thought about how strange it was that the things built with the most love tended to be the ones that stood the longest, while the things built in haste and for profit fell apart in the first serious weather. She was perhaps 30 yards from the barn when she heard them. The sound reached her before she saw anything. A low, collective rumble beneath the wind, mechanical and rhythmic. The sound of many engines working in concert. She stopped walking. She turned toward the road. They were coming down Route 76 from the north. She counted headlights and stopped counting somewhere past 30. Motorcycles moving in a loose formation that was coming apart under the pressure of the wind, which had picked up considerably in the last few minutes and was now blowing in strong, irregular gusts that pushed at anything not firmly anchored to the earth. She could see the riders fighting their bikes, leaning into the gusts, pulling to the shoulder one by one, as the conditions made the road increasingly untenable. She knew what was coming from the sky. She had known it the moment she saw that color. These men were going to be caught out in the open when it arrived. And out in the open in an EF4 tornado was a different category of experience than a root cellar, with poured concrete walls and steel doors. She was still 50 yards from the road when the first bike stopped at the end of her driveway. The rider was big. That was the first thing that registered. He was sitting on a black motorcycle that had clearly been built for distance riding and even seated with a helmet obscuring most of his face. He projected a kind of physical mass that the word large did not quite capture. He wore black leather from the shoulders down, a vest over the jacket covered in patches she could not read at this distance. Behind him, one by one, the other motorcycles were pulling over. She saw the patches more clearly as she got closer. She had lived in Missouri for 68 years. She knew those patches. Every instinct she had, every self-preservation signal her nervous system had developed over nearly 7 decades of living, told her to turn around, go to the cellar, lock the steel doors, wait for the storm to pass, let these men find their own shelter. Every instinct except one, the one that 30 years of nursing had burned into her at a level so deep it had become something close to biological, because there, near the back of the group, a motorcycle had gone down. She could see it from where she stood. One of the bikes had slipped on the wet asphalt, probably caught a gust at exactly the wrong angle, and the rider was on the ground. 2 others had already dismounted and were crouching over him. Even from this distance, she could see the arm. She had seen enough broken arms to recognize one before she was anywhere close enough to make a proper assessment. The angle was wrong. The way the rider was holding it against his chest, the way his whole body was organized around protecting that one point of injury, told her everything she needed to know about the severity. Before she had crossed half the distance between herself and the road, she did not make a decision exactly. It would be more accurate to say that the part of her that made decisions stepped aside and let the part of her that had been trained step forward. Her feet were moving before her mind had finished forming the thought. She grabbed the flashlight from her jacket pocket, and she ran toward them, waving her arm overhead. The big rider at the front of the group turned when he heard her. She could see his confusion even through the helmet visor. An old woman in a flannel shirt running towards 79 Hells Angels in the middle of a tornado, warning waving a flashlight. She reached the edge of the driveway and stopped, breathing harder than she would have liked, and she pointed toward the barn. "There is a cellar under that barn," she said. "Reinforced concrete, steel doors. It has held through 2 tornadoes and it will hold through this one. Get your people off the road right now." The big rider lifted his visor. He was somewhere in his early 50s, she guessed. A gray beard, close-cropped, and eyes that had a steadiness she recognized from years of working in emergency medicine. Eyes that had seen enough difficult outcomes that they no longer registered surprise easily. He looked at her with those eyes for a moment that felt considerably longer than it probably was. Then he said quietly, "Ma'am, do you know who we are?" She said yes, she knew exactly who they were. He said that most people, when they saw the patches, made a different choice. She said that most people were not looking at a broken arm and a tornado at the same time. Something shifted in his face. She would think about that expression later many times in the weeks and months after this night. It was not quite surprise. It was something closer to recognition, as though he had seen something he expected to find, but had stopped expecting to find in a long time. He turned toward his group, and his voice came out in a controlled shout that cut through the wind with the authority of a man who had been giving orders long enough that people had stopped questioning whether to follow them. "Everyone dismount. Leave the bikes. Follow the lady. Now." What happened in the next 4 minutes was the most efficiently organized chaos Margaret Calloway had ever witnessed, and she had spent 30 years in emergency rooms. The riders dismounted. They moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had spent enough time together. That communication had been compressed down to glances and gestures. 3 of the bigger men went immediately to the 2 who were helping the injured rider off the ground. Another pair started moving toward her barn without being told, following the direction she had indicated. She led the main group around to the back of the barn, where the steel cellar doors were set, flush into the ground, and the wind by this point was strong enough that she had to lean into it to walk, and the sky to the southwest had gone a color she had no name for. Something beyond green, something that occupied the part of the visible spectrum that seemed to exist specifically to signal that ordinary conditions no longer applied. 3 of the larger riders grabbed the handles of the cellar doors and pulled together. The rust on the hinges resisted for a moment, then gave. The doors swung back. Concrete stairs descended into darkness. She stood at the top and directed them down. She counted as they passed. 20, 40, 60. The injured rider was carried down by 2 men who moved with a careful steadiness that told her this was not the first time they had transported an injured person. His face was young, late 20s perhaps, with tattoos running up the side of his neck, and his face was pale in a way that had nothing to do with the fading light. He was conscious, which was the important thing. He met her eyes as they carried him past, and there was something in his expression that she did not have time to read before he was through the doors and down the stairs. 73. 75. The wind was not wind anymore. It was a physical presence, a force that wanted to take whatever was not bolted down and add it to its collection. She braced herself against the frame of the cellar door and kept counting. 78. The big rider was the last one to the door. He looked at her, then looked at the sky behind her, and she did not need to look to know what he was seeing because she could feel it in the pressure against her eardrums, and in the way the air itself seemed to be vibrating at a frequency just below the threshold of sound. "Get inside," he said. She went down the stairs. He followed, pulling the heavy steel doors shut behind him with a clang that rang through the concrete like a bell. Then there was the dark and the sound. She had been in this cellar twice during serious weather. She knew the sound a tornado made when it passed close, that combination of wind and pressure, and something beneath both of them that was not quite sound at all, but registered in the body, like sound in the chest and the back of the throat. She knew it, and she had never made peace with it, and she suspected she never would. But she had a flashlight, and she had work to do. She clicked the beam on. The cellar had been designed to hold her family of 3, with room for the neighbors if needed. She had at various times over the years sheltered her sister and her sister's family, 2 neighbors from down the road, and a farmhand named Gerald, who had been caught on the property during a storm in 2011. The space was perhaps 40 feet by 30, with concrete walls and a ceiling just high enough to stand under without hunching if you were under 6 feet tall. It was now holding 79 men. The beam of her flashlight swept across a wall of leather and faces. They were pressed together in the way that large groups of people press together when fear overrides the usual invisible boundaries of personal space. Some of them were still catching their breath from the run. Some were already looking around the space with the focused assessment of people accustomed to evaluating environments. Some were just standing very still, which was what certain people did when they were afraid, and had been trained not to show it. She raised her voice. She said, "Does anyone else have injuries?" Voices came back. The man with the broken arm was the worst. A few others had minor cuts and scrapes from the road. Nothing that could not wait. She said his name, referring to the injured man. A voice said, "Reef. His name is Reef." She moved through the crowd, which parted for her, in the way crowds always parted for someone moving with specific purpose in a confined space. She found Reef sitting against the far wall, supported on either side by 2 men, roughly the size of small automobiles. She crouched down beside him and clicked the lantern on the battery-powered one she kept on the second shelf. And in its steady light, she began to assess the arm. He was watching her with pale eyes that were working hard to stay focused. She said, "What is your name?" He said, "Reef." His voice was tighter than it should have been, which told her his pain management was purely a function of willpower at this point. She said, "Reef, I am going to look at this arm. Some of what I need to do is going to hurt. You can squeeze my shoulder with your other hand if that helps." He stared at her for a moment with an expression she had seen before on young men in emergency rooms. That combination of bravado and gratitude that young men in pain defaulted to when a woman who was not their mother offered them competent kindness. He gave a short nod. She had splinted worse than this with less than what she had in her kit. The break was clean mid-shaft radius and possibly ulna as well, though she could not be certain without an x-ray. The joint above and below were intact. The circulation distal to the break was adequate. She worked steadily and methodically, talking him through each step in the flat, calm voice she had used in 30 years of emergency situations, because flat and calm was what people needed when the alternative was panic. Above them, the tornado arrived. The sound was not like thunder, which came from outside and moved through the air to reach you. This sound came from everywhere simultaneously. It came through the concrete walls and the steel doors, and the earth itself. The pressure in the space changed in a way that made several of the men grab their ears. Dust came down from the ceiling in a thin, continuous sifting, settling on shoulders and in the beams of flashlights. The steel doors at the top of the stairs flexed inward slightly, and then held. Someone in the back of the group began to pray, a low, rhythmic murmuring in English. She did not look up from what she was doing. She finished the splint and secured it, and told Reef not to move the arm, and that she would check it again in 30 minutes. She stood up. The big rider was standing a few feet away. In the light of the lantern, she could read his patches clearly now. The one over his chest said his road name was Ironside. The one on his shoulder identified the chapter. The top patch she already knew. He said his name. He said it was Colt Decker. He said people called him Ironside. He said it quietly, the way people introduce themselves in churches and hospitals, in places where the ordinary volume of life has been reduced by circumstances to something more appropriate to the moment. She told him her name. He said he knew this cellar was not built for 79 people, and he was sorry for that. She told him the cellar was built to hold whatever needed holding, and that was the end of that. He said most people who see us coming, they go inside and lock the door. She said most people do not spend 3 decades keeping other people alive for a living. He said you were a nurse. She said for 30 years, yes. He said that explains the hands. She looked down at her hands without meaning to. They were the hands of a woman who had worked with them for most of her life, competent and direct, and showing all their years without apology. She went to the shelves and began distributing the supplies she had stored there. Blankets, first pulling them from their plastic bags and passing them back through the crowd hand to hand. Then the thermoses. She had 2 large ones she always kept filled in the storm season good coffee, the real kind, because in her experience, decent coffee was one of the things that made the difference between enduring a bad situation and being destroyed by it. The granola bars, the sealed crackers, the bottles of water. The crowd took the supplies and passed them along with a quiet efficiency that surprised her, though perhaps it should not have. These were men who functioned within a structure. They knew how to organize themselves. She sat down on the overturned crate she had kept in the corner for this purpose, and she listened to the sound of the storm working at the earth above her head. And she thought with a part of her mind that always kept running no matter what else was happening about what she would need to do when this was over. Reef she would check on every 30 minutes. The supplies would need to be inventoried and replaced. She would need to assess the structural damage before she let anyone back up the stairs. And she would need to call Lorraine, who was going to be beside herself. Colt Decker sat down on the floor near her, which surprised her because he was not a man who appeared to sit on floors casually. He sat the way big men sit when they are trying to reduce the space they occupy out of consideration for the people around them, which told her something about him. He asked about the cellar, how long it had been here. She told him about Walter's father and the original structure. She told him about Walter reinforcing it in 1989. She told him what Walter had said when it was finished about building it, so she would always have somewhere safe to go. He was quiet for a moment after that. He said he sounds like he was a good man. She said he was the best man she had ever known, and that she had spent 27 years since his death trying to be worthy of the opinion he had of her. Colt was quiet again. He had the quality that some men who had led others through serious situations of being able to sit in silence without making it uncomfortable. Most people filled silence compulsively pouring words into it, the way water fills a vessel. But he sat in it the way some people sat in shade on a hot day making use of it. He asked where they had been headed. She had been curious about this. She did not say so. He told her. A charity run, he said. Annual ride from St. Louis down to Branson. Veterans organizations, homeless shelters, a camp for children with serious illness. They did it every year. Had been doing it for 17 years now. She absorbed the information, and she set it in the place where it belonged. He asked if she had family nearby. She said her sister was in Springfield, about 40 minutes out. He said that was good. He said she would need someone close after a storm like this. She said she had been managing on her own for 27 years and was reasonably confident in her ability to continue. He looked at her sideways at that, not disagreeing, just acknowledging. Above them, the worst of it passed over that concentrated period, when the sound and the pressure combined into something that the body registered as fundamental threat, when the parts of the brain that had been there long before language were running at full power and overriding everything more recent. Some of the men were very still. Some had their eyes closed. A few were talking quietly to the ones beside them in the tone people used when they were talking about something ordinary, because ordinary was what they needed. She went and checked on Reef. The splint was holding. His color had improved slightly. He accepted a granola bar from her with more grace than she expected, which made her revise her estimate of him upward. She asked him his age. He said 29. She said, "You ride well to have gone down in those conditions. Most riders would have gone down 20 seconds earlier." He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, "How do you know about riding?" She said her son had ridden since he was 19 years old. He said, "Oh yeah. What kind of bike?" She said, "The same kind as yours near enough." And that was when she said it. She had not planned to. The words came out the way certain things came out after you had carried them long enough, that they had become part of the weight of breathing, part of the routine effort of simply existing. She said her son had ridden with a club. She said he rode with them for 4 years before he enlisted. She felt rather than saw the change in Colt Decker's posture. Something in his stillness shifted quality. He asked what club. She reached into the pocket of her flannel shirt and took out the photograph. She had carried it there for 11 years, ever since Lorraine had pointed out that keeping it in her wallet meant she was always sitting on it, which was no way to treat a photograph of your child. The pocket was better, closer to where things needed to be carried. She held the lantern up and she looked at it one more time before she handed it to Colt, the way she always looked at it one more time before she gave it to anyone. because she was never entirely sure, even after all these years, that she could bear to let it leave her hands. It showed a young man standing in front of a motorcycle in a parking lot she did not recognize somewhere, flat and Midwestern with a gray sky above it. He was 22 years old in the photograph, and he was wearing the vest of the Missouri chapter of the Hells Angels, and he was smiling with his whole face in the way that some people smiled, who had not yet learned that the world expected more restraint from them. His road name was embroidered on a patch she had made him herself. When he told her he was joining the club, because she was his mother, and she wanted him to have something of hers with him regardless of where he went. His name was Tommy. His road name was Ghost because he moved quietly. She was told later so quietly that people sometimes turned around, and he was already somewhere else, already ahead of them, already at the edge of whatever was coming next. He had been 25 years old when he died in Iraq. 22 years ago, this past April, Colt took the photograph and looked at it in the lantern light and the cellar around them, continued its contained existence. The wind still audible above the concrete walls holding everything in place. And then a voice came from somewhere toward the back of the group. The voice said, "God Almighty." It said, "That is Ghost." The crowd shifted. Men turned. A figure moved forward from the back, working his way through with the urgency of someone who had heard something that required them to be in a specific place immediately. He was older than most of the others, somewhere past 60, with a white beard and a weathered face that had accumulated its years without much attempt at resistance. He looked at the photograph in Colt's hands, and then he looked at her, and the expression on his face was something she had not seen directed at her in a long time. He said, "You are Ghost's mother." She said, "Yes." He said, "You used to send packages to the whole chapter when Tommy first prospected, letters and food." He said his road name was Whitlock, and he had ridden with her son for almost 2 years before Tommy enlisted. He said Tommy used to read the letters out loud in the clubhouse, and every time, without fail, someone ended up claiming they had something in their eye. He said, "I thought about you when he died." He said a lot of them thought about her. He said they wanted to reach out, but they did not know if she would want to hear from them, if she wanted that part of his life to stay separate from the grief. He said they had not known what the right thing was to do. She said she understood. She said she had not known either. Then things happened that she had not anticipated and could not have prepared for. Whitlock turned toward the men around him and said something she could not fully hear over the sound of the storm, and then the crowd reorganized itself in a way she did not understand at first. Men moved and shifted and turned toward her in small groups, not crowding, just orienting, and one by one they began to speak. A man named Crank, who was perhaps 45, told her that Tommy had covered for him in a situation he was not going to go into detail about, and had never once asked for anything in return. A man who went by the name Fuse said Tommy had taught him to ride properly when he first joined, and had the patience of a man 3 times his age. A younger man, barely old enough to have ridden with Tommy before the enlistment, said his older brother had been in Tommy's unit. He said his brother had told him that Tommy was the kind of soldier who did not make speeches about honor, but who was simply functionally incapable of leaving anyone behind. She listened. She had thought she knew her son. She had thought that the 25 years she had with him, the first steps and the difficult teenage years, and the 4 years of riding with the club, and the 2 years of letters from overseas, she had thought that constituted knowing a person. She had been carrying the weight of his absence for 22 years, and in that carrying she had assembled him entirely from what she knew, and she had believed the assembly was complete. She understood now that she had been carrying a partial picture, The complete picture was here in this cellar, distributed among these men in pieces that she had never had access to. It was in Whitlock's voice when he talked about the letters she sent. It was in Crank's reluctance to go into detail about what Tommy had done for him, which told her more about the depth of it than any explanation could have. It was in the young man whose brother had served beside her son. She did not cry. What remained of her crying was reserved for situations that actually required it. But something in her chest that had been held in a specific configuration for 22 years shifted slightly into a different one. The way a load you have been carrying too long on one shoulder redistributes when you finally stop and set it down properly. She felt Colt Decker looking at her. She met his eyes. He did not say anything. Some conversations were better conducted below words, in the place where the things too large for language lived. She had learned this in 30 years of sitting with people in their worst hours. Some things could not be said, but they could be acknowledged, and the acknowledgement was its own form of language, adequate to the weight of the thing. The storm passed, not suddenly, but in the way serious things pass gradually, and then all at once the pressure easing. The sound retreating from its peak, the air changing as the worst of it moved on to wherever it was going next. She sat with that shift for a few minutes, feeling the cellar settle back into its ordinary stillness. She went and checked on Reef one final time before the stairs. His color was good. The splint was secure. He was eating a second granola bar and looking more embarrassed about the situation than pained, which was a reliable indicator of recovery trajectory. He asked her if she needed him to do anything. She said she would let him know. Colt stood at the foot of the stairs. He was looking up at the steel doors the way a man looked at something he was not sure he was ready to see on the other side of. She knew that look. She had seen it in hospitals in the moments before difficult news was delivered, when people stood at the threshold of what came next and gathered themselves. She stood beside him. She said, "I will go first." He said, with respect, no. She let him go first because it was not a hill worth contesting. He pushed the steel doors open. The gray light of early morning came down the stairs in a flat, colorless sheet, and in it she could see the expression on his face change as he looked out at what was there. And the way it changed told her before she reached the top of the stairs what she was going to find. She came up out of the cellar and stopped. The barn was standing, damaged, missing the upper half of its east wall and most of the roof above the tack room, but standing, which was what mattered. The farmhouse was not standing. Where it had been, there was a distribution of material across a radius of approximately 60 yards. She could identify individual components if she looked closely enough. The kitchen window frame, part of what had been the back bedroom wall, the cast iron pot she had kept on the stove since 1987, sitting upright in the driveway as though someone had placed it there. Her truck, which had been parked beside the barn, was in the south field wrapped around the base of the old oak tree she and Walter had put a swing on when Tommy was 4. The porch where she had stood 12 hours ago, watching the sky, was gone completely. She stood in the gray morning light and looked at what remained. She thought about the kitchen with the leaking roof and the wiring that needed replacing, and the pot she had been putting down on the floor to catch the drip. She thought about the bedroom where Walter had died and the hallway where Tommy's school photographs were hung in order from kindergarten to senior year. She thought about the reading chair and the shelves of books and the drawer in the kitchen where she kept things she might need someday and never did. She thought about 27 years of carrying the weight of this place alone. She thought about the insurmountable smallness of what was left. And then she looked at the cast iron pot sitting in the driveway, and she said out loud to no one in particular, or perhaps to Walter, "I never liked that kitchen anyway." Behind her, there was a short silence, and then Colt Decker started to laugh. It was not the laugh of a man who found something funny. It was the laugh of a man who had been holding something very tightly for a very long time and had just been given permission to put it down. It came out of him full and unguarded and genuine, the kind of laugh that was the other side of something, the release after the pressure. And once it started, it ran its course without any apparent ability to stop. Some of the men behind her picked it up, then more. She stood in the ruins of her home in the gray Missouri morning, and she let them laugh because it was the right thing to let happen. Because laughter after terror was one of the things that kept the human machinery running. And she had spent 30 years keeping people's machinery running, and she understood what it needed. Colt came to stand beside her. He was still catching his breath. He said, "You just lost everything and you are making jokes." She said she had not lost everything. She turned and gestured at the 79 men spreading out around the property. She said, "Everyone is alive." He looked at her for a long time. Then he took her hand, not sentimentally, practically, the way one person took another person's hand when they wanted to make absolutely certain the next thing they said was received completely. He said, "Give us 5 days, Maggie. Then look out your window." She said, "I do not have a window anymore." He said, "Trust me." She looked at him, and she looked at the ruins of the house Walter had rebuilt for her. And she looked at the old oak tree with her truck against it, and the 79 men of the Hells Angels Missouri chapter moving through the wreckage of her property in the flat gray light of the morning. And she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not hope exactly. She was too old and had seen too much to call it hope without qualification, but something in the same family as hope. Something that occupied the same general territory, that had the same relationship to the forward direction of time. She had opened a door the night before that she had not known she was going to open. And standing in the ruins of the life she had built on the other side of every previous loss, she understood that the opening of that door had changed something whose full dimensions she could not yet see. She would see them. She had learned that much in 68 years of losing things and continuing anyway. You did not always get to know what you were walking toward, but you kept walking. She picked up the cast iron pot from the driveway, checked it for damage, found none, and set it on the one intact step of what had been her front porch. Some things were built to last. Lorraine's guest room smelled like lavender and good intentions. The lavender came from a sachet on the dresser that Lorraine replaced every month without fail. Part of the same domestic precision that had characterized her older sister for as long as Maggie could remember. The good intentions were less tangible, but equally present, infused into every surface of the room, the way lavender infused the air present in the extra blankets folded at the foot of the bed, and the glass of water on the nightstand, and the nightlight plugged into the baseboard, because Lorraine had decided without asking that Maggie might need one. Maggie lay on top of the covers on the first night and stared at the ceiling and listened to the quiet of a house that was not her house. It was a particular kind of quiet, the quiet of someone else's life, organized around someone else's rhythms and requirements. The refrigerator hummed at a slightly different frequency than she was used to. The furnace came on and off at intervals she could not predict. The neighborhood outside was still in the way that subdivisions were still a managed stillness that had nothing in common with the quiet of a farmhouse in open country, where the absence of human sound was filled by wind and animals and the sound of the land itself doing whatever the land did in the dark. She thought about the cast iron pot sitting on the one intact step of her front porch. She had left it there deliberately, She was not entirely sure why. Perhaps because it was the one thing she had picked up out of the wreckage and put somewhere intentional. Perhaps because it was proof that she had been there, that she had come through the night and walked out into the gray morning and touched something that remained and placed it where someone could see it had been placed on purpose. Perhaps because it was simply the most herself thing she could have done in the moment, and the most herself thing was the thing she needed to hold on to. She did not sleep much. In the morning, Lorraine made eggs and toast and poured coffee without asking how she took it, because they had been sisters for 68 years, and some knowledge accumulated past the point of requiring confirmation. They sat at the kitchen table and ate without speaking for a while, which was one of the things Maggie had always valued about her sister. Lorraine was capable of noise at levels that required regulation, but she also understood when silence was the appropriate choice, and she had the wisdom to distinguish between the two. It was Lorraine who broke it. She said, "The insurance will cover most of the rebuilding. You will be fine." Maggie drank her coffee. Lorraine said she had already called her own insurance agent, who had said that a named storm event like this one typically triggered full structural replacement coverage, and that the process took some time, but the outcome was generally straightforward. Maggie said she appreciated that. Lorraine said she had also been thinking, and she set her fork down in the careful way that preceded statements she had rehearsed, that this might be the right moment to consider whether rebuilding in the same location made practical sense. She said the farm had been a wonderful place to raise Tommy and a wonderful place to be with Walter, but that both of them were gone now, and the farm itself had been struggling for years, and that there was a very nice senior community in Springfield, with a waiting list that Lorraine had already put Maggie's name on 2 years ago without mentioning it because she had been waiting for the right moment to mention it. And she was fairly certain this was the right moment. Maggie looked at her sister across the kitchen table. She said, "You put my name on a waiting list." Lorraine said she had done it out of love. Maggie said she understood that. She said she also understood that her sister had been managing her own anxiety about the situation for years by taking actions that felt like preparation, and that she was not angry about the waiting list. She said she would think about everything Lorraine had said. This satisfied Lorraine to a degree which was the intended outcome. What Maggie did not say, because it would not have been productive, and Lorraine would not have fully understood it, was that the farm was not a location. It was not a piece of property that could be evaluated on a spreadsheet of practical considerations and found wanting. It was the place Walter had chosen. It was the place Tommy had learned to walk in the kitchen that was now splinters scattered across 60 yards of Missouri ground. It was the place she had carried every difficult thing she had ever carried. And the carrying had shaped the place, and the place had shaped her, and they were not separable in any way that she knew. How to explain to someone who had moved 4 times in 20 years and thought of home as a thing that could be replicated with sufficient attention to decor? She thought about it differently. She thought about it the way she thought about patients she had fought for over the years. The ones other nurses had written off as too far gone. The ones where the practical assessment said the resources required outweighed the realistic probability of the outcome. She had never been the nurse who accepted that calculation without argument. She had always been the nurse who wanted to know exactly what the realistic probability was, based on who had run the numbers, and how recently and whether anyone had considered the variables that changed the equation. The farm was a patient, and she was not in the habit of giving up on patients. On the second morning, a man knocked on Lorraine's door. He was neat and soft-spoken, and wore a jacket with the logo of the insurance company Maggie had been paying premiums to for 22 years on the breast pocket. He introduced himself as Frank Neely. He said he was the regional adjuster assigned to her claim. He said he had driven out to the property the previous afternoon to complete the preliminary assessment, and that he had some information she would want to hear. She invited him in. Lorraine brought coffee, which Frank Neely accepted but did not drink, which told Maggie something about the nature of the information before he said a word. He set a manila folder on the kitchen table, and he opened it, and he walked her through the assessment with the practiced smoothness of a man who had delivered this kind of information many times and had developed a method for doing so that minimized the friction. He used technical language where technical language served as insulation. He referred to the policy document in ways that implied its provisions were straightforward and universally understood. He said the words structural non-compliance 3 times in the space of 4 minutes. The substance of what he said was this: the farmhouse, based on the construction assessment his team had completed, did not meet current residential building codes in several areas, specifically the foundation reinforcement standards that had been updated by Tenney County in 2019. Under the terms of her policy, structures that did not meet current code at the time of the loss event were subject to a compliance adjustment that reduced the replacement value to the depreciated actual cash value of the structure rather than the full replacement cost. The depreciated actual cash value of a farmhouse of that age and condition was, he paused here and consulted his folder, considerably less than the cost of new construction on the same footprint. He named a number. She looked at the number. She said that number does not cover the foundation. He said he understood this was difficult news. She said she was not asking him to acknowledge that it was difficult. She was pointing out a mathematical fact. The number he had named would not pay for the foundation of a new structure on that property, let alone the structure above it. He said the policy terms were what they were. She said she had been paying premiums on that policy for 22 years every month, without a single late payment. And that, in those 22 years, she had filed exactly 1 claim for hail damage to the barn roof in 2014, and that the claim had been settled for less than $800. She said she would like to understand in specific terms how a policy she had faithfully maintained for 2 decades was now going to pay her less than the cost of a foundation. Frank Neely closed his folder. He said the policy terms were clearly outlined in the documentation she had received at signing and at each annual renewal. She said she was a retired nurse, not an attorney, and that the documentation he was referring to was 47 pages of language that had been designed by people with law degrees to be understood only by other people with law degrees, and that she did not believe 22 years of faithful premium payments entitled her to 4 pages of technical justification for a number that would not build her a garden shed. He said he was sorry she felt that way. She looked at him across Lorraine's kitchen table for a long moment. She said she would be in touch. He thanked her for his time and left his business card and took his folder and his untouched coffee and left. Lorraine stood in the kitchen doorway with an expression that mixed outrage on Maggie's behalf with relief that the confrontation had remained civil. Maggie picked up the business card and read it. She set it back down. She sat very still for approximately 30 seconds, which was the period of time she had learned over a lifetime of crisis management to allow between the arrival of genuinely bad information and the first action taken in response to it. 30 seconds was enough time for the reactive impulses to exhaust themselves and for the functional part of her mind to resume primary operation. Then she got up, found her reading glasses, and asked Lorraine if she could borrow the car. She drove to the office of a lawyer named Dawson in downtown Springfield, whose name she had gotten from a neighbor 3 years ago in a conversation about water rights disputes. Because in rural Missouri you occasionally needed to know a lawyer's name, and she had written it in the address book she kept in her purse and never thrown away. The office was on the second floor of a building that had been a hardware store in a previous life, and the lawyer himself was a man in his late 60s, with the weathered patience of someone who had spent decades mediating between what people were entitled to and what they were actually going to get. She sat across from him and she laid out the situation in the orderly, sequential way she had always presented case information. The timeline, the policy details as she understood them, the number Frank Neely had put on the table, the phrase structural noncompliance and the specific code amendment it referred to. The lawyer listened without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said there were a few things she should do immediately. He said she should request in writing the full written assessment from the insurance company's structural team, including the specific code section cited. He said she should gather her complete payment history, every premium, every renewal, every piece of correspondence. He said she should file a formal written objection to the claim determination with the State Insurance Commissioner's office, which had a consumer division specifically for this kind of dispute. He said she should do all of this before she spoke to Frank Neely again. She asked him if he thought she had a case. He said that, in his experience, when a large insurance company moved very quickly to invoke a technical exclusion on a long-term policyholder, following a major declared disaster, there was generally a reason for the speed that had less to do with the merits of the exclusion and more to do with the value of the asset in question. She asked him what he meant by that. He said he would look into it and call her. She thanked him and drove back to Lorraine's house and sat down at Lorraine's kitchen table with her address book and the reading glasses and the notepad she carried in her purse, and she began to construct the file. This was the work she knew: the intake form, the timeline, the documentation trail, the organized accumulation of verifiable fact. 30 years of nursing had been in large part the practice of this exact skill applied to different subject matter. The assembly of information into a structure that could not be argued with because it was simply, irrefutably what had happened. Hospitals ran on documentation. Cases were won and lost on the quality of the record. She had trained generations of younger nurses in this truth. If it was not written down, it did not exist. And if it was written down incorrectly, it was worse than not existing at all. She had every premium payment receipt. She kept them in a box in the order she received them, organized by year, going back to the origination of the policy. This was not a system she had created in anticipation of any particular problem. It was simply how she managed paper, the same way she managed everything, with the assumption that the record mattered and that the day you needed it would come without warning. She spent the afternoon building the file. She was on the 4th year of premium records when her phone rang. It was Colt Decker. He asked how she was. She said she was fine, and that the insurance company was attempting to pay her significantly less than the replacement cost of her home on the basis of a technical exclusion she intended to challenge. There was a brief silence on his end. He said he had been doing some reading since he got back to St. Louis. He said a man in the club named Art had also been doing some reading. He said Art had a background in financial investigation before he retired and joined the club, and that when Art started reading things, he tended to find things that other people had not looked for yet. She asked what Art had found. He said he would rather tell her in person. He said he was coming back to Tenney County in 2 days to start organizing what they were going to do about her house, and that he would tell her then. He said she should continue what she was doing with the documentation, because it was going to matter. She asked him how he knew what she was doing. He said he had spent 30 seconds talking to her and had a reasonable working theory about what she did when she encountered a problem. She told him she would see him in 2 days. She went back to the premium records. On the fourth day, Lorraine drove her out to the property to meet the insurance company's structural assessor for a walkthrough that Frank Neely had arranged without consulting her about the timing, which was itself a data point she added to the file. The assessor was a young man who moved through the debris with a tablet computer and took photographs and spoke into a voice recorder and answered her questions in the shortened technical vocabulary of someone who had been instructed to limit the scope of his communication. She walked the property herself after he left. She walked where the kitchen had been, and where the bedroom had been, and where the hallway with Tommy's school photographs had been. She picked up things she recognized and set them down again. She found the reading chair, or what remained of it, its frame intact, but the upholstery stripped away by the wind, looking skeletal and surprised in the middle of what had been the living room. She found 3 of Tommy's school photographs still in their frames face down in the south field. The glass broken, but the photographs intact in 2 of the 3 cases. She put those in her jacket pocket. She found her grandmother's pie plate unbroken, sitting in the driveway as though someone had set it there. She picked that up too. She was standing at the edge of where the foundation had been when she heard the truck. Colt's truck was a dark green Ford that had the look of a vehicle used for practical purposes rather than statement-making. And when it pulled into the driveway, he was not alone. There were 2 other vehicles behind his, and when they all got out, she recognized Whitlock and Reef, and a man she had not been introduced to formally, but who she remembered from the cellar as the one who had organized the distribution of the blankets with a quiet efficiency that told her he was accustomed to managing logistics. This man Colt introduced as Art. He did not give a road name. He said Art had spent 18 years as a financial investigator before he decided he preferred motorcycles to conference rooms. She said, "What did you find?" Colt looked at Art. Art was a compact man, somewhere in his late 50s, with reading glasses on a lanyard around his neck, and the careful diction of someone who had spent years presenting findings to people who did not want to hear them. He said he would give her the short version first and the long version after she decided whether she wanted it. She said she wanted both. He said the short version was this: Commissioner Dwight Harlan had spent the past 14 months acquiring land in Tenney County from owners who had experienced significant property damage or financial distress. The acquisitions had been made through a holding company with a name that did not include Harlan's name, and was registered to an address that was a mail forwarding service in Kansas City. The properties acquired included 6 of her immediate neighbors, all of whom had sold at prices significantly below assessed value, several of them within 60 days of a significant loss event. The corridor of land that resulted from these acquisitions ran directly along the route of a federally funded highway expansion project that had been announced in preliminary form 8 months ago and would be publicly confirmed within the next 12 to 18 months. The land values along that corridor, once the highway project was confirmed, would increase by a factor of several times their current assessed value. He paused. He said her property was the last one in the corridor that Harlan did not control. She stood in the ruins of her property and looked at Art. She said, "In the insurance company." He said Frank Neely had processed 7 of the 8 previous claims in the corridor. All 7 had been settled at depreciated actual cash value rather than replacement cost. All 7 had used the same structural non-compliance language. 4 of the 7 property owners had sold within 90 days of receiving the settlement. She said, "How long has this been happening?" He said the earliest acquisition he could document was 16 months ago, but the relationship between Harlan and the holding company appeared to go back further. He said he was still pulling records. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the field where her truck was still wrapped around the oak tree. The county had not yet sent anyone to deal with the debris. The road past her driveway was still partially blocked by a fallen utility pole. The machinery of official response was moving at the pace it always moved, measured and bureaucratic, addressed to the aggregate rather than the particular. She thought about Dwight Harlan going to county commission meetings. She thought about him shaking hands and signing paperwork and building a corridor of acquired land, one distressed property at a time, quietly through a company no one would connect to him, waiting for a highway announcement that would make him wealthy enough that the original investment would look like pocket change. She thought about 7 of her neighbors selling their land for less than it was worth, because the insurance settlement left them no alternative. She felt something she did not feel often. Not grief, not fear. Anger. Clean and specific and energizing in a way that grief and fear were not the anger of a person who had identified a precise wrong and was assessing the precise actions available to address it. She had felt this anger in hospitals when she encountered systems that were failing patients, not through malice but through indifference. And she had learned over 30 years that this specific kind of anger was useful if it was directed at the problem rather than at the people, and if it was backed by documentation. She said, "I need to make some calls." Colt said, "We have people who can help with the legal side." He said he was not going to push her on that. He said it was her call and her situation, and she would run it the way she wanted to run it. She looked at him. She said she appreciated that. She said she had been managing things herself for a long time, and she was not planning to stop. She said she would take the help where it made sense, and she would tell him when and how it made sense. He nodded. She called the lawyer from Dawson's office that afternoon and added everything Art had told her to what she already had. The lawyer was quiet for a longer period than the first time. Then he said the word interesting. He said he would look into the holding company. He said the connection between the insurance adjuster and the commissioner, if it could be documented, changed the nature of the claim dispute substantially. She said she had a financial investigator with 18 years of experience who had already started pulling records. The lawyer said he was beginning to understand why the insurance company had moved so quickly on her claim. She spent the 5th day working. She drove back to the property in the morning and she walked the debris field with the methodical attention she brought to every task, cataloging what remained, identifying what was salvageable, building the record of loss that she would need for the legal challenge. She took photographs. She made lists. She contacted the state insurance commissioner's consumer division and filed the formal written objection, using the specific language from the policy document that the lawyer had identified as the most defensible ground for the challenge. She was at the property that same morning, standing near the collapsed section of the barn's east wall, when Colt's truck pulled in again. He was alone this time. He got out carrying a plastic bag, the kind used to protect documents against moisture sealed at the top. He walked toward her with a quality of deliberateness she had come to associate with him when he had something to say that he had been thinking about for some time. He said his crew had been going through the barn structure the previous day, assessing what was salvageable and what needed to come down before rebuilding could start. She nodded. He said they had found something inside the wall cavity of the cellar's east face. He said the concrete had cracked along an old seam during the storm, and behind the cracked section, in a space between the poured wall and the original fieldstone foundation that no one would have known was there, was a plastic bag. He held it out to her. She took it. She could see through the plastic. Inside was an envelope. The envelope was sealed. On the front, written in a handwriting she recognized immediately in the way you recognized handwriting you had read 1,000 times, was her name. Her full name. Margaret Ann Calloway, not Mom. Her full name the way he had written it on the birthday cards he made her in elementary school, in the careful letters of a child who had been taught that a person's full name was how you indicated the seriousness of what you were saying to them. She stood in the debris field of her farm, with the bag in her hands, and she looked at the envelope inside it, and she felt the ground shift slightly under her feet, in a way that had nothing to do with the storm damage. She opened the plastic bag. She opened the envelope. The letter was 2 pages written on notebook paper in Tommy's handwriting, which had improved considerably from the elementary school birthday cards, but retained that same quality of deliberateness of a person who chose each word as though the word mattered, and the choosing of it was a form of respect for the person who would read it. It was dated March 2004. He had shipped out in April. She stood in the morning light and she read. He said he hoped she never had to read this. He said that if she was reading it, then something had happened that he could not prevent from happening, and that he was sorry for that, and that he needed her to know a few things. He said the club had promised to look after her. He said he had made them promise years ago before his first deployment, and that they had renewed the promise before this one. He said he knew she was independent and would resist being looked after, and that he was relying on them to be persistent enough to get past her resistance, and that he was relying on her to let them eventually, because she deserved people in her corner, and he was not always going to be able to be that person. She stopped reading. She stood with the pages in her hands, and she looked at the property around her, at the barn, and the debris and the foundation where the farmhouse had been, and she felt the weight of 22 years of carrying things alone, and she felt the weight of the letter in her hands, and she felt the specific quality of grief that came not from new loss, but from old loss arriving in a new form, showing you the dimensions of what had been missing all along. She made herself continue. The second part of the letter was different in tone, crisper, more specific. Tommy wrote that in the months before his deployment, he had become aware of something happening in Tenney County that he believed was wrong, and that he had gathered information about it carefully over time, using connections he did not go into detail about. He wrote that the information was in a separate envelope that would be delivered with this letter inside the same wall cavity, and that it concerned a pattern of land acquisition and official misconduct that he had not had the opportunity to bring forward before leaving, and that he was entrusting it to the club, because he trusted them to see it through if he could not. He wrote that he did not know exactly what the information would be worth by the time anyone read it. He wrote that some things got worse over time when no one stopped them, and that he hoped it was not too late. He wrote that he loved her. He wrote it twice, once at the end of the first part, and once at the very end of the letter in larger letters than everything else, as though he wanted to make sure that whatever else she took from reading it, that part came through clearly. She folded the pages. She put them back in the envelope. She stood in the quiet of the morning for a long time. Then she looked up. Colt was leaning against his truck 20 feet away, giving her the space the moment required. He had his arms crossed and his eyes were on the middle distance, the way a person looked when they were trying to be present without intruding, the way certain men looked who had learned that presence and intrusion were not the same thing. She said, "Why wasn't this delivered? If Tommy left it for the club to find." Colt was quiet for a moment. He said Tommy had told the chapter president where the letter was hidden, inside the wall cavity, with instructions to retrieve it if he did not come back. He said the president at the time was a man named Garrett. He said Garrett had died in a highway accident 8 months after Tommy shipped out, before any news came back from overseas, before anyone knew to look for the letter. He said nobody else had known. The knowledge had gone with Garrett, and the letter had stayed in the wall. She absorbed this. 22 years, 8 months short of being found and acted upon. A highway accident and a wall cavity and the specific way that circumstances accumulated into the shape of things being left undone. She looked at Colt. She said, Tommy wrote that the information is in a second envelope. There was a second envelope in the plastic bag. She drew it out, unsealed it. Inside were 4 pages of tightly written notes in Tommy's handwriting, and several photocopied documents. Some of them county records, some of them what appeared to be financial records, some of them correspondence. The name that appeared most frequently in the notes was one she had not known 22 years ago, but knew now. Dwight Harlan. She crossed the distance to Colt's truck, and she held out the second envelope. He took it. He read the first page. He read the second. His expression did not change in any dramatic way, but something in it solidified the way a solution solidified when the last necessary element was added to it. He looked up at her. She said Tommy was 23 years old when he gathered that information. He was 23 years old and he was preparing to leave for a war, and instead of spending his last weeks at home, he spent them documenting a land scheme in his home county because he believed it was wrong, and he thought someone should stop it. Colt said nothing. She said he asked the club to finish what he started. Colt said yes. She said, I am asking you the same thing. He looked at her across the hood of the truck. The morning was clear and cold, and the field around them was still scattered with the debris of her former life, and somewhere behind the tree line a crow was making the sound. Crows made in the aftermath of storms persistent and carrying. He said, we are going to need to talk to Art. She said, I already called the lawyer this morning. I'm going to call him again this afternoon with what is in that envelope. He said this is going to get complicated. She said she had managed complicated for 68 years and had not yet found a version of it she could not work through. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the cellar. That quality of recognition of finding something he had expected to find, but had stopped expecting. He said, Reef wants to tell you something. He said it the way people said things that were important without explaining why they were important, the way doctors sometimes spoke to other doctors in the presence of patients in shorthand that carried more than the words themselves. She said she would call him after she finished with the lawyer. She stood on the ruined foundation of the house Walter had built for her, and she held Tommy's letter in one hand, and the crow went on calling in the trees. And she thought about what 22 years of absence looked like when you turned it over and found the other side. It looked like a letter in a wall and a name repeated across 4 pages of careful handwriting, and a 23-year-old who had believed with the particular uncomplicated conviction of someone who had not yet had it beaten out of them that wrong things could be made right if someone was willing to do the work of making them right. She thought about Frank Neely closing his folder and saying the policy terms were what they were. She thought about 7 of her neighbors selling their land for less than it was worth. She thought about a corridor of acquired properties running to the route of a highway that Dwight Harlan knew was coming. Because men like Dwight Harlan always knew things were coming. Because they arranged for things to come. She put Tommy's letter back in its envelope and the envelope in her jacket pocket next to the school photographs she had found in the field. She took out her phone and called the lawyer. He answered on the second ring. She said she had something new to share with him. She said it was going to change the shape of the conversation considerably. He said he was listening. She told him about the letter. She told him about the second envelope and the name that appeared most frequently in the notes. She told him that the information had been gathered 22 years ago, and that the pattern it documented appeared based on what Art had already found to have continued and expanded in the time since. The lawyer was quiet for a moment longer than he had been either of the previous times. Then he said, Mrs. Calloway, I think you should come to my office tomorrow morning. She said she would be there at 9. She hung up. She looked at the field one more time. The crow had gone quiet. The morning was still and cold, and everything that needed to be done was visible from where she stood. Not easy, not fast, not without cost, but visible, identifiable, addressable in sequence, the most urgent first. The way she had always done it. She had the documentation. She had the letter. She had the lawyer and the financial investigator, and 112 days of premium receipts and the particular stubbornness that came from building a life on difficult ground and refusing to leave when the weather got bad. She turned toward Lorraine's borrowed car. She had work to do. They came down Route 76 on a Thursday morning, and the sound of them arrived before they did. Maggie was standing at the edge of her property with a cup of coffee she had brought from Lorraine's house, watching the tree line to the north when she heard it. Low at first, the way distant thunder announced itself before the storm was visible, a vibration in the air that you felt in the chest before you registered it in the ears, then building, then filling the morning completely, that collective mechanical roar that had a quality unlike any other sound she knew, something between music and weather, something that moved through the body rather than simply reaching it. She had heard 79 of them arrive 5 days ago in wind and rain and crisis. This was different. This was 300 motorcycles coming down a clear Missouri morning with nowhere else to be and nothing else to do. And when they came around the long curve where Route 76 bent south, and the line of them became visible, stretching back further than she could see. 2 lanes of chrome and leather moving in a formation so extended it looked less like a group of vehicles and more like a feature of the landscape. She set her coffee down on the one intact step of her former porch, and she put her hand over her mouth, not to stop herself from crying. She had cried the night before alone in Lorraine's guest room, with Tommy's letter on the nightstand and the school photographs arranged against the base of the lamp. She had given herself that the full weight of it, the letter and what it meant, and the 22 years of not knowing it existed, and the particular shape of the grief that came from discovering that your child had tried to take care of you from a great distance and across an interval of time that had swallowed the attempt whole. She had let herself feel all of it, and by morning she had converted most of it into something she could use. She put her hand over her mouth because the sight of it was simply too large for her face to know what to do with 300 men coming to her property on a Thursday morning. Because one woman had opened a cellar door in a storm, and the inadequacy of any expression she could produce in response to that fact required some physical management. Lorraine stood beside her and said absolutely nothing, which was the most useful thing she could have done. Colt's truck was at the front of the procession, moving slowly, leading the line in. He pulled into the driveway and got out and walked to where she was standing. Behind him, bike after bike turned off Route 76 and onto her property, filling the driveway and spilling into the field engines, cutting one by one until the sound retreated in stages. And the morning went quiet in a new way, the quiet of 300 people standing still. Colt said, "We have 27 chapters represented. Contractors, electricians, plumbers, all volunteers. Materials are in the trucks behind the bikes." He said it straightforwardly, the way you stated the facts of a situation, when the situation was already speaking for itself, and additional commentary would only diminish it. She looked at the line of pickup trucks that had followed the motorcycles in loaded beds, covered in tarps, against the morning damp tailgates, lettered with company names from across Missouri and beyond. She said, "This is going to take some organizing." He said Art had a logistics plan. She said she would want to see the plan. He said she would want to see it because she was going to have notes on it. She said she was going to have notes on everything and he should let Art know. Something moved in this corner of his face that was not quite a smile, but occupied its territory. He introduced her to the group. He stood in the open field with 300 people assembled in a rough half-circle in front of him, and he spoke without a microphone in the voice he used when he needed to be heard. Not shouting exactly, but carrying the voice of a man who had been talking to large groups of people in open air for a long time. He told them who she was. He told them about Ghost. He told them that Tommy Calloway had ridden with the Missouri chapter for 4 years before he put on a uniform, and that he had been the kind of man whose absence left a shape that other people spent years trying to fill, without quite managing it, and that the woman standing in front of them had raised that man from the beginning, and had been carrying the loss of him for 22 years, with a dignity that put most of them to shame. He told them about the letter. He told them what Tommy had asked. The field was very quiet. He said they were there to build a house. He said they were also there to finish something that should have been finished a long time ago, and that the two things were going to happen in parallel, and that Art would coordinate the building side, and that Maggie would be involved in every decision, because it was her house and her land and her life, and no one was going to make choices about any of those things without her direct input. He looked at her when he said that. She nodded. Art had the logistics plan on a clipboard, and it was as organized as she expected from a man with 18 years of financial investigation. Behind him, broken into teams by trade and task, sequenced in the order that building required, with material staging areas marked on a hand-drawn site map that was more detailed than the one the insurance adjuster had produced with his tablet computer. She looked at it carefully, and she had 3 notes. He incorporated all 3 without argument, which raised her opinion of him further. By 9 in the morning, the debris field was being cleared with the collective efficiency of 300 people who had been organized into teams with clear assignments and who understood the value of working without talking more than necessary. By 10, the foundation had been assessed by the 2 structural contractors who conferred and agreed on the approach and began marking the footprint of the new structure with stakes and string line. By 11, the first lumber delivery was being offloaded and staged. Maggie moved through all of it. She did not stay in one place. She moved from team to team the way she had moved through a hospital floor on a busy shift, checking in, assessing, redirecting where redirection was needed, answering questions when she was the one with the answer, and deferring when she was not. She knew nothing about the mechanics of construction, but she knew a great deal about how systems of organized people either functioned or failed, and the principles were similar enough that she could apply them across the domain. She found Reef mid-morning working one-handed near the lumber staging area, his splinted arm held against his chest, in the proper sling she had fashioned on her second visit, when she could give it the attention the first night had not permitted. He was doing something with lumber that should not have been possible, with one arm managing it through a combination of body positioning and refusal to accept the limitation as final. He set down what he was holding when he saw her coming, and she could tell from his expression that he had been waiting for her to come. She said she was not going to say anything about the arm. She said Colt had told her he wanted to speak with her. He walked with her to the edge of the activity where the noise was reduced enough to talk without raising their voices. He was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone organizing what they needed to say, rather than hesitating about whether to say it. He said he had worked for Dwight Harlan for 3 years. He said he had been 25 when he took the job, answering an ad for IT support and office systems management at the county commissioner's office, and that he had been grateful for the work because jobs in Tenney County were not plentiful, and he had debts and a truck that needed its transmission rebuilt. She listened. He said that in his second year, he had been given expanded access to the office server to upgrade the email archiving system. He said that in the course of doing that work, He had seen things he was not supposed to see, not by looking for them. He had not been looking for anything. He had been doing his job, and the things had been there in the system, visible to anyone with server-level access who happened to be in the right directory at the right time. He said the emails were between Harlan and a man named Stiles, who ran the holding company, and between Harlan and Frank Neely, and that they were specific. They were not the emails of people who were being careful. They were the emails of people who believed that the administrative structure around them was sufficient insulation, that no one was going to look too closely, because no one had any reason to look. She said, "What did you do?" He said he copied them to a USB drive, and he kept the drive, and he quit the job 6 weeks later and joined the club and did not know what to do with what he had been not knowing for 3 years. He reached into the inside pocket of his vest and held out a small black USB drive. She took it. She looked at it sitting in her palm, smaller than her thumb. 3 years of not knowing what to do with it. She said, "Why are you giving this to me now?" He said because when she had knelt beside him in the dark of the cellar and put the splint on his arm and talked him through it in that flat, steady voice he had thought, without quite articulating it to himself at the time, that this was the kind of person you gave things to. Not because she would decide the right thing to do, because she would do the right thing, regardless of whether it was easy, and that was different. And he had not encountered it often enough to mistake it for something else when he saw it. She closed her fingers around the drive. She said she was going to give this to her lawyer, and that she was going to make sure he knew where it came from, and that it had been obtained in the ordinary course of professional duties, and not through any unauthorized access. He said he understood. She said she was also going to make sure that his cooperation was on the record as voluntary and proactive, because that would matter for him specifically. He said, "Okay." She said, "Your arm is healing correctly. The swelling is down. You can probably come out of the sling in 4 days, but you are going to need an X-ray before you ride." He said, "Yes, ma'am." She went and called the lawyer. The lawyer said to bring the drive to his office that afternoon. She said she would. She went back to the construction and worked until noon, and then drove to Springfield and sat across the desk from the lawyer while he looked at the contents of the drive on his office computer, with the careful attention of a man who was seeing something that changed the scope of what he had already understood to be a significant situation. He said, "This is documentary evidence of conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, wire fraud, and abuse of public office." She said she was aware. He said this was no longer just a claim dispute. She said she was aware of that too. He said he needed to make some calls. He said she should go back to her property, and he would contact her by end of day. He said she should not discuss the contents of the drive with anyone other than the people already in the circle. She drove back. It was mid-afternoon when the county vehicle arrived. It was white with the seal of Tenney County on the door, and it pulled up on the road outside her property and stopped. And the man who got out was wearing the uniform of the county sheriff's department. He was in his mid-50s, broad through the shoulders, with the expression of a man who had been sent to do something he knew was going to be difficult and had arranged his face in advance to communicate that the difficulty was not his personal preference but merely the execution of his professional obligations. His name was on his badge, Sheriff Dale Pruitt. She had not known the name before Art told her it 3 days ago. She knew it now. She knew that Dale Pruitt had signed 2 of the property transfer documents for Harlan's holding company. She knew that his signature on those documents meant he had not been a passive bystander to what Harlan had built in Tenney County. Pruitt walked to the edge of her property. He did not come onto it. He stood at the road, and he said in a voice carrying enough that it reached the nearest workers that he had received a complaint about unlicensed construction activity on this property, and that under county ordinance he was required to issue a stop work order pending verification of permits and licensed contractor documentation. The activity around the property did not stop, but it shifted quality. The people nearest to the road had heard, and the information moved outward through the group, the way information moved through a crowd. And by the time it reached the people furthest from the road, they were already looking up and orienting toward the situation. Colt was on the far side of the property. He started walking toward the road. Maggie was closer. She reached the road before Colt did. She stopped at the property line and looked at Pruitt. And she said, "The lead contractor on this project is licensed in Missouri and has all applicable permits. The documentation is in the site office, which is the barn, and you are welcome to review it." Pruitt said the complaint specifically cited the foundation work as proceeding without the required county inspection sign-off. She said the inspection had been requested 4 days ago, and that the county had not yet sent an inspector, and that in a declared disaster area, the county's own emergency construction guidelines allowed foundation work to proceed after a 72-hour waiting period, if no inspection had been scheduled. Pruitt's expression did not change, but something in it recalibrated. He said there was also a question about the property's status relative to an ongoing insurance claim, and that county policy was to defer construction sign-offs on properties with unresolved insurance claims to avoid complicating the settlement process. She said, "Mr. Pruitt." She said it in a particular way, not loudly, not angrily, in the tone she had used for 30 years with hospital administrators who came to her floor with policy justifications for decisions that were going to harm patients. The tone that said she understood exactly what was happening and was going to speak to it directly, and that the person she was speaking to should adjust their expectations accordingly. She said she was aware of his name on the transfer documents for Harlan Development Holdings. She said her lawyer was aware of it. She said the state insurance commissioner's office was aware of it. She said that within the next 48 hours, additional parties at the state and federal level were going to become aware of it, and that the position he was currently in, standing at the road in front of her property, issuing a stop work order at Dwight Harlan's instruction, was a position he might want to reconsider before it became a permanent feature of the public record. The field behind her was very quiet. 300 people had stopped what they were doing. Pruitt stood at the road. He was a man who had spent his career in a position of institutional authority, in a county where the institutional authority had been for at least 14 months, pointed in a direction that served specific interests at the expense of everyone else. He had worn the weight of that authority so long, he had stopped feeling it as weight. He stood at the road and felt it now, the full and unredistributed weight of what he had been part of pressing down on him in front of 300 witnesses on a clear Missouri afternoon. He said, "I'm going to need to make a call." She said she thought that was probably a good idea. He walked back to his vehicle. He sat in it for a long time. Then he drove away. The field stayed quiet for a moment after his taillights disappeared around the curve. Then someone started to clap. It moved through the group the way the laughter had moved after the tornado person-to-person building until it was general and full, and occupying the whole field. And she stood at the road with her back to all of it, and looked at the empty stretch of Route 76, where Pruitt's truck had been, and she let herself breathe. Colt appeared beside her. He said, "You knew his name." She said she knew a good many things at this point, and intended to know considerably more before she was done. He said, "What do you need?" She said she needed a phone and an hour, and she needed the construction to continue without stopping. He said both of those things were available. She called the television station in Springfield herself. She had thought about this the previous night. Not the specific station, but the principle of it. The idea that the documentation she had accumulated, and the letter Tommy had written, and the USB drive Reef had kept for 3 years, constituted a story that needed to be in the air publicly, in a form that could not be quietly managed by a county commissioner, or quietly ignored by an insurance company that was counting on her running out of resources or resolve. She had thought about it, and decided that the moment for it was when the stop work order arrived, because the stop work order would crystallize everything into a single visible action. A man in a county vehicle coming to her property to prevent her from rebuilding her home. And that image would do work that a stack of documents could not do by itself. She asked for the news desk. She said she had a story about disaster relief obstruction, insurance fraud, and 22 years of a dead soldier's unfinished business, and that she had documentation for all of it, and that there was currently a construction crew of 300 people on her property who had just been issued a stop work order by a county official whose name appeared on fraudulent property transfer documents. The third person she was transferred to asked her to repeat the part about the dead soldier's unfinished business, and she did. And there was a pause, and that person said they would have a crew there within the hour. She handed the phone back to Colt. He looked at her. She said the construction should not stop. Whatever happens when the cameras arrive, the construction should not stop, because the visual of 300 people building a house while the cameras are here is more useful than anything I can say. He said, understood. The news crew arrived in 55 minutes. 2 of them, a reporter and a camera operator, driving a station wagon with the channel logo on the side. The reporter was a woman in her mid-30s, with the alertness of someone who arrived at a scene and began immediately processing what she was seeing and reorganizing it against what she had been told. She looked at the construction activity. She looked at the 300 people. She looked at the site where the foundation was already poured, and the framing was beginning to rise. She looked at Maggie. She said, "Mrs. Calloway, can you walk me through what happened here?" Maggie said she could. She did not perform it. She did not modulate her voice or arrange her expression, or choose her words for effect. She said what had happened in order clearly, the way she would have described a patient's history to a new physician coming onto a case. She said she had sheltered 79 men during an EF4 tornado. She said the tornado had destroyed her home. She said the insurance company had offered her a settlement that would not pay for a foundation on the basis of a technical exclusion that she believed had been applied at the direction of the county commissioner. She said she had documentation supporting that belief. She said her attorney was in contact with the state insurance commissioner's office and with law enforcement at the state level. Then she took Tommy's letter from her jacket pocket. She had thought about whether to read it publicly, whether it was too private a thing to put into the air in front of cameras. She had decided that Tommy had written it to be read, and that the people who needed to hear it were not limited to her. She had decided that the 22 years of it sitting in a wall while Dwight Harlan operated freely in the county Tommy had grown up in was an argument against privacy and for the full light of public knowledge. She read it. She did not rush it. She read it in the same level voice she had used in the cellar. The voice that had nothing left to prove and no reason to perform. She read the part about the club's promise, and the part about how Tommy knew she was independent and would resist being looked after. She read the part about the information in the second envelope and what he had gathered and why. When she got to the last line, the one he had written twice, the one in larger letters than everything else, she paused. She did not look at the camera. She looked at the letter. She said, "My son kept his word. He kept it across 22 years, and a war, and his own death." and I am keeping mine." She folded the letter. She put it back in her pocket. The reporter was quiet for a moment. Then she asked one more question. She said, "Mrs. Calloway, a county official, came here this morning and issued a stop-work order. What did you say to him?" Maggie said she had told him the truth about what she knew, and that he had chosen to leave. The reporter looked at the construction behind Maggie, the frames rising, the men working, the organized activity of 300 people. Doing what 300 people with a clear purpose could do on a good morning. She said, and the construction continued. Maggie said the construction had not stopped for a single minute, and she intended to keep it that way. The segment aired that evening. By the following morning, the phones at the county commissioner's office were not working, a fact she learned from the lawyer who told her he had also received a call from a contact at the state attorney general's office who had seen the broadcast and had some questions about the transfer documents he had sent over the previous day. The lawyer said the word interesting again this time, with a satisfaction in it that had not been there before. She said, "What happens next?" He said, "Next, it moves faster than you expect." He was correct. Dwight Harlan was taken into custody at his office on a Friday afternoon 2 days after the broadcast. The arrest was made by state investigators, not county, which was a detail the lawyer had anticipated, and arranged for by routing the documentation through the state attorney general, rather than through any county law enforcement channel. Frank Neely contacted the state investigators voluntarily the following morning and provided a statement. His lawyer negotiated the terms of his cooperation before noon. She was at the property when the lawyer called to tell her. She was standing where the kitchen had been, watching the framing crew work on the second floor. And she listened to the lawyer describe the sequence of events in his careful way. And when he was done, she said, "Thank you," and she ended the call, and she stood in the morning air. And she thought about 7 neighbors who had sold their land for less than it was worth. She made a list. She gave the list to Art, and she told him that the documentation he had assembled on those 7 properties was going to be needed by the state investigators, and that she wanted him to make certain it was complete and organized and delivered to the right people in a form that could actually be used. Art said he had been waiting for someone to ask him to do exactly that. The house went up in 72 hours. Not because it was a simple house. It wasn't a simple house. Colt had told her they were building what she had always wanted, and she had told him she wanted 4 walls and a roof. And he had listened to that the same way he listened to everything she said, with full attention and zero compliance. The result was a craftsman-style house with a wide covered porch that ran the full length of the front face, deep enough to put chairs on and sit in the evening, which was all she had ever wanted from a porch. Solar panels on the south-facing roof sections, which Art had quietly arranged because he had opinions about long-term operating costs. A kitchen with real light 2 east-facing windows that would catch the morning sun in the way that the old kitchen's single north-facing window had never managed, and the barn repaired and reinforced with the name Calloway carved into the beam above the main door by a man from the St. Louis chapter, who did woodworking in his non-riding life, and who spent an entire afternoon on that single beam with a set of chisels refusing assistance. She walked through it on the morning it was finished. She walked through it slowly, room by room, with the particular attention she brought to anything that mattered. She noted what had been done and how it had been done, and she understood in that walk-through that the people who built it had been paying attention to what she said, and also to what she had not said, to the things she had revealed about herself in the days of working alongside 300 people who were very good at paying attention to the nature of the person they were working for. The reading chair had been replaced. Dark green upholstery, not the washed-out floral of the original, and positioned in the southeast corner of the living room, where it would catch the afternoon light through a window that had not existed in the old house. She stood beside it for a long time without sitting in it. She went outside. Along the front path, 79 rose bushes had been planted, one for each man she had sheltered in the cellar, in 2 parallel rows that led from the road to the porch steps. They were bare-caned in the November cold, but she knew what they would look like in June, and the knowledge sat in her chest like something warm. At the eastern edge of the property, near the old oak that had been cleared of the truck's wreckage and found to be sound, there was a stone. Gray granite set on a simple base. She walked to it. The stone read, Thomas William Calloway, son, soldier, brother. He kept his word. She put her hand on the stone. She stood there in the cold November morning with her hand on the granite, and the bare rose canes lining the path behind her, and the new house rising on the foundation of the old one. And she felt the full weight and the full lightness of the moment simultaneously, which was the only way she had ever found it possible to feel things that were too large to feel only one way. She did not have words for most of it. She did not try to find them. She took her hand off the stone and she turned toward the house. The gathering that evening was Colt's idea, but she would have arrived at it herself if he had not. It was not a ceremony exactly, or not only a ceremony. It was what happened when 300 people who had spent 3 days building something together did not quite want to stop being in the same place as each other, did not want to let the particular quality of those 3 days disperse back into ordinary time. Someone lit a fire in the field. Someone else produced a grill from somewhere, the logistics of which she did not track, and the smell of food moved through the evening air in the comfortable way of meals that were not planned, but were simply assembled out of what people had brought, and what people were willing to share. Children ran across the field in the half-dark, catching fireflies, and she had not known some of these men had children, and the sight of it did something to her that she did not try to analyze. Colt found her on the porch. He said there was something they wanted to do if she was willing. She said she was generally willing to know what a thing was before she agreed to it. He reached into his vest and held out a patch. She looked at it. It was the Hells Angels' death head, which she recognized. But the border was gold, and the word stitched beneath it was one she had not expected. Mother. He said it had never been given to anyone outside the club in the history of the Missouri chapter. He said the vote had been unanimous across all 27 chapters, represented, which he wanted her to understand was not a procedural formality. He said 27 chapter votes had each been a separate conversation, and each had come back the same way, which told him something about how the people in those conversations had felt about what she had done and who she was. He said, Tommy asked us to take care of you. We are asking you to let us. She held the patch in both hands. She looked at it for a long time. She thought about Lorraine's waiting list and the senior community in Springfield, and the carefully managed quiet of a life made small enough to be survivable. She thought about the farm and the cast-iron pot sitting on the one intact step. She thought about a letter in a wall and a 23-year-old who had believed that wrong things could be made right. She thought about what it meant to let people in. Not the soft version of letting people in, the version that cost nothing and required only the acceptance of casseroles and phone calls. The real version. The version that meant you were known, and that being known was not something you managed or controlled, but something you inhabited. She had been very good for a very long time at not inhabiting it. She looked at Colt. She said, after Walter died, I managed this property alone. Tommy was grown, but he was not finished needing a parent, and neither of us knew how to do what came next without the other. I made every decision without help, because help had a way of not being there when you needed it. and I had learned early that the most reliable person in any situation was myself. He did not say anything. She said, "I know that is not a character trait that makes things easy for the people around me." He said, "No, it is not." She said, "I am not going to change it entirely." He said, "I know." She said, "But I am 68 years old, and I have a new house, and 79 rose bushes, and a stone in my field, with my son's name on it, and the people who put all of that here did it because of a promise my son made, and because of a door I opened in a storm." She paused. "I think I can manage to let that mean something." He said, "It means everything." She accepted the patch. He pinned it to the left side of her jacket over the pocket where she kept Tommy's photograph, which she thought was fitting in a way that was either accidental or was not accidental at all. He stepped back. She looked out at the field, the fire, the people, the children with the fireflies, the motorcycles parked in rows along the edge of the property, the new house with its lit windows behind her. 300 people who were going to ride back to 27 different places in the morning and carry whatever this was with them when they went. Reef was near the fire, his splinted arm in its sling eating something off a paper plate with the focused attention of a man who had been working one-handed for 3 days and had earned his feelings about a proper meal. He looked up and saw her looking, and he raised the plate slightly the way people raised a glass, without the formality of a toast. And she nodded. Whitlock was sitting on a folding chair near the oak tree, talking to a man she did not know. And when he saw her looking, he raised his hand, and she raised hers. She went inside and made coffee. She made a full pot, the real kind, and she carried it out to the porch on a tray with cups she had found in one of the boxes a brother from the Kansas City chapter had packed from the donated household goods cups she did not recognize, but which would become familiar. She poured coffee for whoever came to the porch. A good number of them came. They sat on the steps and on the porch railing and on the chairs that had been set out along the front, and they drank the coffee and talked about things and did not talk about things in equal measure. And the fire in the field went on burning, and the children went on chasing fireflies, and the November night was cold and clear and absolutely still. Colt sat in the chair beside her. They were quiet together for a while, the way they had been quiet in the cellar, below the level where words were necessary. He asked what she was thinking about. She said, "Thomas." She said, "Tommy." She said, 30 years of keeping other people alive, and the specific feeling of being 68 years old and finding out you had only seen part of the picture. He said, "And now." She looked at the field. She said now she was thinking she should have made more coffee. He looked at her sideways. She said there was a full pot inside and that it would keep. He said, "I will get it." He got up and went inside. She sat on her porch in the November dark, and she listened to the fire and the voices and the sound of the motorcycles settling in the cold, the way metal settled with small ticks and contractions adjusting to the temperature of rest after a long day of movement. The reporter from the Springfield station called her 3 weeks later to do a follow-up segment. At the end of the interview, she asked Maggie the question she had been waiting to be asked, the question that wrapped around the whole of it and required only one answer. She asked if Maggie had any regrets. Maggie was sitting on the porch in her reading chair, which she had moved outside for the afternoon because the day was warmer than November had any right to be in Missouri. And she had a cup of coffee and the field in front of her with its bare rose canes and the stone near the oak tree and the lane where Tommy had learned to ride his bicycle and later his motorcycle, and which was now lined with the evidence of what 300 people could do in 3 days when they had a reason. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. She thought about 68 years of opening doors and closing them. She thought about the doors she had opened and what had come through them, and the doors she had closed, and what she had kept out, and whether the balance of those choices had been correct, and whether correct was even the word for it. She thought about Walter building a cellar so she would always have somewhere safe to go. She thought about Tommy writing a letter so she would never be alone. She looked at the reporter. She said just one. She said she wished she had made more coffee. The reporter laughed, and from the field where Colt was helping Whitlock fold up the folding chairs from the gathering the night before, which had been there since, and which neither of them had gotten around to bringing inside, she heard both of them start to laugh as well, because the porch was close enough to the field that they had heard. And that was the thing about a porch that faced the land and the people on it. Nothing was lost. Everything carried.